Hello, my name is Tom Bogart, and I would like to speak to you about art for a better world. Now, this topic is out of my comfort zone in the sense that I am not an artist myself, in the sense that I've never produced a work of art that could be sold or arguably admired. It may seem a bit presumptuous for a non artist, a historian in particular, to talk about art. But when we look at this construct of art for a better world, I would observe as a historian that this concept is almost an oxymoron. Artists operating in a capitalist society approach art, I would argue, from the perspective of producing a commodity, something that could be sold in order to make a living and win notoriety and celebrity, a product to be consumed, or an investment in order to gain a return on capital. Art is, in other words, a reflection of society at large, and for many contemporary artists, the production of art as something to be made, aesthetically enjoyed, no longer has a larger social message. So the purpose of my talk is to consider the role of artists in inspiring social change. And in exploring this idea, I'm going to take the unusual avenue of looking at the Psalter Map. Now, if you're an artist working in Chelsea or Feralton or Maniwaki or Fort Collonges, if you're a sculptor or a painter or a novelist or a poet, you could certainly be forgiven for never having heard of the Psalter Map or even knowing what a psalter is. Now, a psalter is essentially a medieval book, a devotional book, which was essentially, the Psalms were written inside of it. And Psalms were often sung in the church avenue. Now, books were very rare, and paper did not exist. Books were written by scribes on vellum or treated animal hide. So only the most important texts could be produced in book form before the printing press, and only the wealthiest individuals were capable of owning such objects. Now, the majority of texts were actually Bibles until the Gutenberg press was invented in the 16th century. And only a few of them also had illumination, which is essentially what the Psalter Map here to the right is. That is, that the monk or a artist actually embellished the text by engraving, painting in an image, often of a biblical theme. So the first thing is, if you're an artist and you're looking at this image, one of the things that's very impressive about it is the fine level of detail, because the Psalter itself, as a small book, is only 17 by 12.5 centimeters in size. And this particular illumination, or what you could call a painting or illustration, is part of a medieval genre called the mappa mundi. And mappa simply meant a kind of napkin, and mundi meant essentially detail. And based on the references in this illustration, we know it was sometime in the late 13th century or what historians would call the High Medieval Ages. Now, in detailing the Psalter Map as an artifact, I've gone over some of the history that explains its use. But when we look at it from a modern framework of the 21st century, the first thing that we try to decode is, what exactly is this Psalter Map? Is it a map or is it a painting? So in other words, relative to this medieval artifact, we're projecting modern categories. So what is a map in a modern sense? Well, a map is essentially a recording of terrestrial geography, various landmarks. We often use it for navigation. Take a left on Baker Street, and then you arrive at the church, and then it's the third house on the right. So maps are something that's very different from paintings. Now we look at this as a painting. One of the things that we see is that it has certainly elements of a painting in the sense of fine illustrated images of various symbols, including Christ and the angels and other aspects of it. So artists use symbols as a means to convey meaning. There's an audience that they have in mind, and the reason that they're creating this work of art is to say something about the world. So what I would like you to do is to think about the Psalter Map. Is this a map or is it a painting? Certainly you can see elements of geography, like the Red Sea and Jerusalem at the center, and we also see elements of a painting. So at first glance, it's not really clear whether the Psalter Map is a map or a painting. Now, our first reflex in looking at medieval artifacts and references to angels and demons would be perhaps to assume that these were primitive peoples, that they believed in superstitions, and they lacked the benefit of modern science. But let's go back in time and try to figure out the history of these types of illuminated manuscripts called Mappi Mundi to figure out whether we should classify it as a map or a painting. Now, first of all, we should not assume that the medieval people were ignorant. Actually, the Mappa Mundi was not used for terrestrial navigation. And although medieval people certainly didn't have the wealth of our science and technology, when you look at a portolan chart, which was used by medieval merchants, for example, from Venice to get to Lebanon or Syria to trade spices, one of the things that you see is that this map used for essentially sea voyages has very fine detail. So when it came to constructing maps that were useful for navigation, the medieval people, although certainly their cartography was not up to our standards, they didn't have satellites and modern versions of trigonometry. Nonetheless, they were quite sophisticated, and it was very much possible for a ship to travel from the Baltic all the way through the Mediterranean to the Near East. So what was the Psalter Map? Well, one of the things that maps also do is they provide an illustration of the known world. So there was another class of maps which are called TO maps. So you can see the T and the O rendered here. And if you think about Herodotus writing the history of the known world by going to the Library of Alexandria, well, the known world from a medieval point of view was limited. They didn't know about the New World across the Atlantic. They didn't really transverse the Sahara, and they didn't really go across the Urals. They had a sense of Asia. They knew that China was out there. So when it came to illustrating what their world looked like, they essentially rendered it in this T and O configuration. So Europe was here, Africa was there, there's the Mediterranean, and then here is Asia. So this was a way of essentially arranging the important areas of the world graphically to illustrate what was known about it. Now what you can see in this version is it's still a TO map. You can see the O and you can see the T, the Mediterranean, the Nile, creating the T inside the O, the known world. And if you go to this Psalter map, you can see another thing. Again, it's kind of the TO is replicated, but Christ is on the top. Now, this is very significant because the medieval people were not looking at the world through the lens of a Newtonian universe. From them, heaven and earth intersected in ways, and I'm not going to go into all the cosmology, but what we're seeing here is that one of the characteristics of a mappa mundi is that it's creating a kind of an intersection between the world that was known, lived, and experienced versus the cosmos as a whole, the creation, the universe essentially created by God. Now, the idea of a mappa mundi might seem odd. The TO map doesn't really fit our notion of what our world looks like. So if we think about a contemporary map, a geopolitical map, this is, most school children would recognize this as a representation of their world. But what most people are not aware of is that our representation of the world also contains certain biases and prejudices. And of course, one of the prejudices is that somehow the center of the world is the West, that the prime meridian goes through Greenwich, England. And, another bias of the Mercator projection is that, Europe is not just at the center of the world, but it's much larger than the global South. Now, if we look at the Psalter map, one of the things that we can do is we can go over the symbols of the author, deconstruct them to get a deeper sense of what was the meaning of this document. So one of the things that's very important is at the very center of the Mappa Mundi is Jerusalem. You can see it in this illustration here. Now, Jerusalem was, of course, the birthplace of Christ. It was the center of the world, also called the axis mundi. This is where the cardinal orientation point around which Christian reality was mapped. And the idea of Christ sitting on a throne above the earth as a ruler was a very medieval idea. If you think about the divine right of kings, the kings ruled in the name of Christ. They were his surrogates on earth, and this gave them the right to rule humans. Christ sits on the east. You can see the sun depicted there. Our maps are north-oriented. The Christian maps were oriented towards the east, the rising sun, which is the idea of Christ and the rebirth of the world. Now, around the world, there are kind of cardinal directions as well as winds depicted. The winds, if you think about the 9 heavenly spheres and Ptolemy's dream and some of these other ancient texts, were in a way inspiring spirits that radiated the presence of the heaven across the earth. Another important demarcation in the map is the distinction between the civilized world and the barbarians. So in Ethiopia, there were rumors about these strange tribes, monsters, dragons, people without heads and eyes inside chests. If you think about the origins of contemporary racism, some of its deepest roots trace back to this medieval idea that's across the known world, the antipodes. In these unknown regions, there lurk these barbarians. Now, the principal, kind of idea that's communicated in this Psalter map is, in essence, it is mapping on biblical stories onto terrestrial geography. So if this is a TO map, what we can see are many biblical stories are replicated there. You have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. You have the Red Sea, over which the Israelites fled on their way back to the Holy Land. So what we see is a transposition of a mythical biblical past onto the known world in which medieval people lived. And this is the idea captured to a degree in Augustine's City of God. There's this heavenly realm and there's the city of man, and these are separate, but they're also completely intersecting. Now, one of the ways to understand that is the purpose of medieval life was not to get rich. Medieval society was not a society of mass abundance. It was a very difficult place in which to live. There was rampant violence. There was significant malnutrition. The promise was, the doctrine of salvation, that in the future world you would be united with Christ in heaven and the heavenly abode. So in that sense, the Psalter map could be seen as providing the geography of salvation. What you wanted to do, where you needed to get in medieval times was, not to a more prosperous future or a ripe old age or to get that, beautiful house. The thing that you needed to do was to survive this world, live a moral life so that in the future you would be in this blessed eternity, perfect state of happiness. And what the Mappa Mundi is essentially laying out is how heaven and earth intersects and how one gets to heaven, which is essentially what the church was. Its primary function was in medieval society as well. So when we look at the Mappa Mundi and deconstruct it, what we see is that the medieval way of looking at the world was fundamentally different from our modern society. When their cosmology, or their understanding of how the world fit together, the average medieval person had a very sophisticated sense of the universe and how it intersected with their daily lives. And I would say that's very different from the person who lives in a modern 21st century technological society. Our world is very complex. We feel impotent. Forces like climate change are constructed by a complex system over which we can't exercise any control. Whereas the medieval people, at a fundamental level, lived in a world that was relatively stable, that they understood that no matter what tragedies may befall their daily lives, ultimately this intersected with a created order and a plan. Now, when we look at these maps and we try to decode their sense of time and space, it's very different from our secular notion that everything is material, that the most important thing is being able to measure things like the distance between, Tokyo and London. In the medieval sense, these absolute distances are not what is important. What is important on the map is how the stories of the Bible and the story of creation relates to your daily life. Now, Christ as the ruler of earth on the top is very significant because when we think about space and the organization of cosmos and these various universes and astronomy, that's the modern way of looking at the universe. But from a medieval sense, Christ was both up and out. He was in the heavenly abode. He was also the ruler, and he was watching over humanity, and he was infusing the world with his sacral power. So in the medieval sense, there was a very strong distinction between the sacred and the profane. And my point is that this is quite different from modernity. In the medieval sense, everyone is important. Everyone is going to be saved. Every animal in the universe, if you think about Noah's Ark, every animal has a place in the created order. Everything is holy. So if we think about it in another story of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, the idea is only the rich man can pass through the needle. When we think about modern society and capitalism and Gordon Gekko and Wall Street, greed is good. What is the purpose of society? Well, by consuming, we will learn we will get to a better life. Libertarian gospel. Greed is good. If I do what's good for me, it creates economic growth and we all benefit. Of course, the obvious lie of that from ecological perspective is that the average ecological footprint of anyone living in Pontiac is that it takes 3 to 4 Earths to support our consumer lifestyle. All the food and plastics that we consume from Costco and then throw away in the oceans that pollute the ecosphere and are leading to ecological degradation. The other thing about medieval cosmology is the relationship between the body and the soul. In a way, we have no idea of the sacred anymore. Everything is material. There's no life after death. Maybe your cat has a soul, but cows are simply T-bones and filet mignon. They're commodities to be consumed. Afterlife, there's nothing that happens to us. It's not like in the medieval times where you're aspiring to commune with Christ and the saints. And I would argue that the medieval idea of the connection between your life and the garden of creation is also fundamentally different. In essentially a capitalist society, the earth is not a garden. Essentially, the resources of the earth are something to be consumed, used for our own personal happiness, and there's no responsibility relative to future generations or the global poor or other species that are being extinguished in our mad dash towards consumption. So let me return, to my central query to you. Is the Psalter Map a map or a painting? In a sense, it's neither, or in a way, it's both. It's really a mappe mundi, or in other words, it's a illustration of medieval cosmology. And until Elon Musk invents a time machine who can go back in time, primary sources, medieval documents allow us to go back and see how people in these distant times looked at reality. And what we are confronted with is that, although this is the society from which we sprung, there's a vast gap between the medieval ages and the modern age. One of the things that we can see in the Psalter life is how capitalist society is so different from the Christian cosmology of our ancestors. What is the point of capitalism? Essentially, the American dream, as projected out in advertisements, is all about producing a demand of stimulating people to purchase products, and that this would create the illusion of fulfillment, happiness, living the American dream. The capitalist society is all about focusing on our material existence, producing new products, and it's not in any way promoting ecological responsibility or even a long-term self-interest in terms of preserving the biomes that sustain the capitalist system, which is ultimately resting on this ecological foundation. So contemporary capitalism, particularly its consumerist form, What did George Bush say after 9/11? It's patriotic to go shopping. Or Deng Xiaoping, to be rich is glorious. In Asia, now the American dream, consumer capitalism, has accelerated as well. And this is essentially promoting a type of narcissism, a type of gluttony, in which one's personal consumption trumps all. There's no responsibility to the earth or the network of creation or any connection between us and the natural world. And this is, of course, what's creating this crisis, a sense of isolation and loneliness, or one of the other concepts, which is really threatening our young people, eco-anxiety, a fear about the ecological horrors that are going to visit us in upcoming generations and our inability to do anything about this. So my digression into the Psalter Map actually has a narrower purpose. I'm essentially calling out the artist of Pontiac to consider how your métier has a role to play in terms of creating a better world, and how artists in various ways could help the community to mobilize for the ecological crises to come. Now, it's well known that art is able to reveal the unseen, the reality just beyond words, the deeper reality. And of course, our society, our consumer society, is veering towards a destruction. So to what extent can the artists of Pontiac, whether you're a painter or a sculptor or a singer or a thespian, to what extent can your art help to illuminate the road that we need to travel to get to ecological balance, to preserve the garden, to promote a better future for our children? Now, many artists in a capitalist society, obviously it's difficult to separate us from this, but are you, an entrepreneur that's producing art in order to buy a McMansion, or are you have a role as a critic as well of the society in which we are in? There was a role in biblical times, the old Israelites of the prophet, that when they would criticize the society. So to what extent have artists in the past served the role of prophets to warn people that our civilization's on the wrong track and to illuminate the pathway to a better world, the change of course? I think many artists are very sensitive. We are aware of these realities. You are conscious of how art can potentially serve as healing, as therapy. Artists can go to schools and to help young children deal with their eco-anxieties. Artists can be community building in terms of bringing people together to talk about these hidden horrors, the ecological problems that we're not dealing with. I also think, perhaps as a Calvinist, thinking back on this example, is that artists could also, like Martin Luther, potentially catalyze society to transition from capitalism rapidly to a system or a society that would be more equitable and more ecological. So what is the purpose of Art for a Better World? Well, first of all, in a way, the launch of this project was based on the idea of gathering the artistic community of Pontiac, which is spread, some of the areas around Chelsea, the rim of Gatineau, and of course across the two river valleys, the Ottawa and Gatineau River Valley. The artistic community is very diverse. We have artists working in different media. We have artists working in different linguistic communities, French and English communities, and we can't always communicate with each other. So one of the purpose of the Art for the Better World project is, thinking about strategically how could we unite the artistic community and have a conversation together. And the conversation that we would like to have is to talk about the greatest dilemma of our time, which is climate change. And what could we as artists contribute to this discussion? And I think we have a lot to say because artists can see beyond the surface to the deeper realities. And if we were together and to speak with one voice, and what could we say about the status of our world and what needed to be done? I think that artists have this ability to see beyond the surface, to see a pathway to a better future. We can't go to a better future if we can't imagine it. And until we can imagine a better future and what it would look like, it's impossible to draw a roadmap to it. So let's come together. We're going to try to organize a conference. And let's draft a charter. Like Martin Luther, what are the 95 theses about a better world? And, if we can articulate these principles, maybe we can start to focus on putting them into action into our community right here and right now. Because if we start to act in 20 years, it will probably be too late. And, we're in this very large merchant vessel, super tanker, is going in one direction towards ecological catastrophe. If we're going to change the momentum, it's a slow-moving ship. We got to start doing it now. So, if this topic has been of interest to you, I encourage you to like our Facebook page, and I encourage other members of the page to post articles and thoughts that you may have about this topic. I also invite you to look at this ThinkLink document where I have illustrated in various ways how historically artists have served in the past as prophets for change. And relative to the local community, I encourage you to go to Cocorico and to make your voice heard relative to propositions that have already been made by fellow members of the Pontiac community, whether they are entrepreneurs, municipal officials, farmers, artists, young people, our senior citizens. What is it that we need to do over the next 20 years so our descendants, our children, can inherit a better world?